In my view, it is not overstating things to say that Jacques Derrida is the most important philosopher of our time. He is, of course, no longer living. He died in 2004, but his work continues to be enormously influential, and many of his writings continue to be published for the first time. It is difficult to know how to offer a helpful point of entry to his writing and thinking. I could say that Derrida's work helps us to see how signs work in the absence of their capacity to reflect meaning. I could say that his work shows how the system of signs by which we experience meaning is unstable, how the sentences we utter, no matter how precisely constructed, are unable to shore up meaning altogether. I could say that Derrida helps us to grasp how we fail again and again to communicate, not just with our audience, but even with ourselves. And these points would all point in the direction of this larger argument that Derrida is making in all of his writing. The experience of presence, of being present to one another, of being present to ourselves, of being present in the communication that flows through us, is more a performance of what we hope for rather than a realization of what is secure or given. I could also talk about how Derrida's argument is an argument with Plato, and that it is an astonishing and persuasive critique of the philosophy of presence that came from Plato and that has dominated intellectual life in the West for thousands of years. And yet, perhaps, the simplest way to think about deconstruction is the discovery that a sentence does not simply represent meaning, but that it performs meaning. A sentence is more an event than a reflection. A sentence happens, whether it is being written or being read, or spoken or heard. A sentence happens in time. It moves from sign to sign, letter to letter, word to word. During that movement, the most characteristic feature of how meaning happens is that it does not stay the same. The movement from sign to sign is a movement of meaning disclosing a difference of one moment of meaning to the other. Let's take a simple example of the sentence. There is a tree. If we regard the sentence as an event, we can notice that the first sign in this sentence, there is a tree, the first sign is the word there. The next sign is the word is. So there is a movement from there, which is a place or a position, we might say, to is, a verb that signifies being. There is. A place exists, we might say. There exists, we might say. But the next sign is a, which we will interpret as a word, not just a letter. That is, it is an indefinite article that points beyond itself to a coming referent, a singular referent, which if we keep reading is the word tree. A tree. There is a tree. So by the time we get to the end of the sentence, we have moved from signifying that a place exists to saying that a tree exists. There in that place, and even replacing that place. There is a displacement from the sign of the place, there, to the sign of the tree. Tree, the word tree. We could ask, does the place exist or the tree exist? In one moment of signification, it is the place that is emphasized. In the next, it is the tree. One sign leads to another. Place is not tree. Tree is not place. Or we could even say, there is not tree, and tree is not there. Both of these things need to be true in order for it to be experienced as true that there is a tree. Another way to say this is that difference is required to experience meaning. The sentence that produces the experience of the meaning that a tree exists, in that place there, harbors within it an essential difference between there and tree. That is the condition of possibility for there to be a tree in our experience meaning of the sentence. And at the same time, it is also the case that what is happening literally in the event of the sentence is the statement that there is not simply there. There is also a tree. What was there at the beginning of the sentence is by the end of the sentence a tree. Whether you follow this or not, it may seem rather uninteresting since we are just talking about trees. But when we apply this critique to more significant signs, there is a good deal more at stake. Let's take, for example, Derrida's argument about speech and writing, summarized nicely in the introduction to our reading by Derrida. Ever since Plato, at least, we have tended to think about writing as a problematic extension and approximation of speech. Writing extends speech by making someone's words available to an audience who is not present for a speech. But writing also approximates speech in that it represents words that are used in speech as markings on a page. The markings on a page stand for words that are otherwise spoken. And, as Plato pointed out, writing is plagued by problems associated with the absence of the speaker. We read a written text in a different time and place than the moment that it was written. The writer is not typically present with us, and so we are not able to hear the words spoken in the writer's voice with all the cues to the intended meaning we might find in their vocalization or body language. The writer cannot correct our misunderstandings or clarify our confusion. As written texts often survive their authors, we may read a text that was written thousands of years ago, making it even more difficult to know what the author meant across all those years. All of this makes it seem to us that speaking makes the meanings meant by the speaker more present to us when we are listening to a speaker speak than the meanings we ascribe to a written text. This is the same distinction that John Durham Peters tracks in describing the preference in the West for Socratic dialogue over Christological dissemination. We think discussion among a few is more reliable than words scattered like seed to the four winds, picked up by whoever happens to come across them. But here's the thing that Derrida notices by a careful critique of the way that the argument for speech over writing unfolds. It turns out that all the characteristics of writing that make it seem less reliable to us than speech makes the author of a letter less present to us than does a speaker of speech. All of these characteristics are also true of speech. A word spoken and even performed bears no closer a resemblance to an idea or a sensation than does a word written. The sound of someone saying tree while they are right in front of us, right now and right here. We might pause here to ask, where is right now and right here, even if I was not coming to you on a YouTube video recorded now at an earlier time, then you will end up viewing it. Or even if I was with you in class and not just on Zoom, but in a real classroom. In any event, the sound of the spoken word tree is no more closely related to an actual tree than is the written word tree, T-R-E-E. That relationship, as Locke already noted, is arbitrary and invented. We are no more present to each other in speech than we are in writing, according to Derrida, because all of the forms of expression that we value as making one another more present in speech, vocal inflection, meeting of eyes, nonverbal communication, are also all simply more signs to be interpreted. And in fact, as we realize when we think about it, these nonverbal signs are as easily misinterpreted as spoken or written signs. This is why Derrida ends up arguing that speaking is a kind of writing. All of the problems of absence that we notice in writing are also true of speech. This is also a setup for the argument that Derrida is making in the essay assigned to you, Signature Event Context. He is engaging in an argument here with speech act theorists like Searle and Austin, who argued that there are two kinds of speech, at least: illocutionary speech, on the one hand, in which the saying of something is the doing, such as, I arrest you, or I pronounce you husband and wife. On the other hand, perlocutionary speech is where my speech reflects or characterizes something that is already true or that I wish for you to believe, such as, that person really should be arrested, or they look like such a happy couple, they really should get married. Derrida's point in the essay that we read today is that all of the characteristics that we associate with illocutionary speech, that where the saying of something is in some sense the doing of it, These characteristics are also true of perlocutionary speech. All speech, to some extent, is a performance of the thing to which it presumes to refer. That person really should be arrested is an act of judgment and application of guilt, even if it doesn't carry the same weight as an officer of the law pronouncing, "I arrest you." What if we thought of all of our spoken and written communication as a performance, a speech act, an event in time in which something is happening? What if we noticed how sentences move from sign to sign, creating meaning effects that change over time, moving across differences, shifting and changing perspective, in order to produce what we might experience as a coherent meaning, a meaning that is based on an unstable and changing presentation of signs? What if we understood this shifting and changing perspective as a trembling, a shudder, or a shock within the apparently stable system of signs that makes all meaning possible? For Derrida, at least, it means that we would define communication as exactly this trembling of meaning, this displacement of force that signifies and connects. Communication, in other words, is a kind of disturbance, a provocation, and deconstruction is the disclosure of this disturbance, this movement of difference. There are those who regard the coming of deconstruction as the return of sophistry, of dissoi logoi, the same thing as good and bad, just and unjust, true and false. For myself, I am with those who seek deconstruction as the return of biblical speech, Hebraic speech, speech that does things with words. Let there be light. Make straight the way of the Lord. I forgive you. Welcome home. What do you think of this way of thinking about what happens when we speak and write?